At this point, I'm sure everybody is familiar with the 2010 Chargers, the most dynamic offense that year, putting up the #1 yards in the season for the 2010 season, as well as being coupled with the #1 defense, which has a bit of an asterisk, but we'll get back to later. And infamously, this team didn't even make the playoffs. And with a great offense and a great defense, you have to ask yourself, how do you even lose a game, much less miss the playoffs? And that, my dear viewer, is how we get to the third phase of football, the greatest third, special teams. Oh, and turnovers. These guys do love to give the ball away in big moments, but special teams played a humongous role. Now, if I were just to tell you, hey, their special teams were bad, I likely wouldn't do as good of a job of secret base, which is why I haven't touched this topic. But then I made a video quantifying the Titans special teams disaster, and many people suggested I go back and do this for the 2010 Chargers. So last week I did a deep dive, crunching numbers, finding the total damage that the infamous Chargers special teams did through a metric known as hidden yards. Now, as many like to point out, there are no yards that are actually hidden, which is right, and another name for this could pretty much just be the special teams discrepancy yardage, but that doesn't sound nearly as cool, so we're calling it hidden yardage, where we're comparing starting field position of special teams plays, net punt stat, kick return stat, whether they're more or less than a touchback, and missed field goal yards given. The whole point of this stat is that if you throw it in under total offensive yards, it pretty much clears up any confusion a game could have. For example, my favorite one, the Lions dropped 52 points on the Titans, while the Titans outgained the offense with 416 yards compared to the Lions' 225. That wouldn't make sense, even with the 4 turnovers, but when you throw in a hidden yardage discrepancy of 429 yards, yeah, that pretty much fills in all the gaps you need to know. But let's get to this Chargers season, and admittedly, in the back half of the season, they had actually fixed a lot of their problems. Not all, but a lot. In fact, their last game of the season, in a game against the Broncos, they actually won the field position battle as well as the net punt battle, as they had a couple decent returns, while the only things hurting them was a missed 53-yard field goal, losing an onside kick, and oh yeah, 97-yard kickoff return touchdown. Now, while you may think that this would normally be a disaster for a team, it only had them down 78 special teams yards. So their 447 yards of offense were pretty much balanced out by the Broncos' 337s. And the cool thing about hidden yards is, let's add those together and boom, it's 447 yards to the 415 that the Broncos had, while the Chargers won by just 5 points, and that just kind of feels right. Now, the game before that is the one anomaly of the season where they actually played really tight special teams. Yes, they lost the starting field position battle pretty much off the back of a shank punt, setting the Bengals up at the 32-yard line, but they still won the net punt battle overall, the penalty battle, the kickoff return battle. So all in all, they were up 17 yards at the end of the game. And this is a great time to tell you that most of the time when you do a special teams breakdown like this, the yardage usually hangs out at plus or minus 15 to 30 yards because the NFL is an extremely high parity league. Now, the Chargers got trounced that game, but it wasn't the special teams' fault. And the game before, we got to see what could have easily been happening most of their season as they won the field position battle, net punt, penalties. So aside from allowing the Niners to return kickoffs to pretty good field position all game, and their one legitimately good special teams play they had all year, which is a kick return touchdown get called back thanks to a penalty, they had 17 yards in their favor and smacked the Niners 34-7, and heck, even against the Chiefs, despite missing a field goal, they won the net punt and only lost the hidden yardage battle by about 30 yards. But that didn't matter because they held the Chiefs to 67 yards of offense in a dominant 31-0 win. Now here's another asterisk. In completely lopsided wins like this, hidden yards can feel a little biased because the Chiefs technically won the hidden yards off the back of consistently returning the ball, which the Chargers literally couldn't do because the Chiefs never scored. But like I said, it's just to give context, so if we add those yards past the touchbacks, all 27 of those yards the Chiefs had, they still didn't surpass 100 total yards this game, which is just depressing. But the last 4 games were just too little too late, and it only got incredibly worse from here. And before I get into the worst of the worst, I'm going to take you to their only good game, where in the midst of the struggle, they were playing against the Colts, and offensively, it was an even matchups, with the Colts getting 303 yards on offense and the Chargers getting 301, but a shanked Pat McAfee punt, a couple of big penalties, and all staying close on the kickoff return game led to the Chargers gaining 98 hidden yards, with the largest chunk of that being their starting field position being 10 yards closer on average average than the Colts, which is how they won this game by 22 points, also on the back of 2 pick sixes. So now let's start looking to our disastrous first half of the season. There were a few less interesting games in the mix, so we're going to knock those out fast, and that's every game where the Chargers only lost the hidden yardage battle by 75 or less yards, and that was against the Patriots, which was a pretty tame game. It was a deadlock battle in net punt. The Chargers ended up eking out some extra yards as far as the kickoff return battle, but they lost all those yards thanks to a missed field goal. Now, notably, this missed field goal was a game-time missed field goal, so maybe it should be weighted for more. I haven't figured out if I want to do that or not, but just yard for yard, pound for pound, it was a deadlock, negative 0.09 in favor of the Patriots. The game before that, they only lost by 46 yards with no notably big plays on special teams, but getting outdriven by the Rams in a 3-point loss, and early against the Cardinals, they actually won by 6 yards, which was just icing on the cake of the 419 yards they had put up compared to the Cardinals' 134 in a decisive 41-10 win. Now for the game that could be called a disaster. Let's start Chargers-Broncos week 11. While they won this game handily, it didn't mean the special teams didn't try to stop them. They missed a field goal, allowed 2 rather large kickoffs to set up the Broncos in great field position, and a big punt return to start them on the plus 39-yard line going in, where if the Chargers didn't play lights out defense, this 81 yards of field position donation to the Broncos could have played a bigger role. Then 2 weeks after that against the Raiders, they would get crushed in the field position battle as their average starting drive was inside the 20 thanks to some clutch pin punts. They also wouldn't be able to return a kickoff past the 20 except for one time, while the Raiders were consistently getting out of their own end zone, earning themselves an extra 91 yards on top of the fact that they outgained the Chargers offensively by 80 yards to make this a dominating 15-point victory in a more death by paper cut style for special teams. But this is nowhere close to their worst. Let me take you to their matchup against the Texans, where we couldn't even get past the opening kickoff while the Chargers were starting on their 4-yard line. Things get worse as a punt gets tipped to only go a yard past the line of scrimmage and then return to the 8-yard line, which is pretty much the two things carrying the special teams hidden yardage battle, and we're not even out of the first quarter, as the Texans averaged over 10 yards closer to scoring on their starting field position. They easily won the net punt battle thanks once again to the tip, and had a total of 103 hidden yards in their favor, where the game was ultimately decided by a late thrown interception, as well as the Texans turning it over on down twice in the second half, showing us just how hard this Chargers defense had to work to win games. But this would take us to week 2, where they were taking on the Jaguars, and let's just keep it real. The Jaguars were completely outmatched, but on top of their 6 turnovers by the Jaguars, they were still able to try to make some special teams plays. They blocked a punt, they got a ton of consistently good returns to pile up over 100 yards of special teams hidden yardage over the Chargers, despite losing by 25 points. And the last mild, yes, we're still technically only in mild disaster range game, is when they took on the Titans, and the only thing in the Chargers' favor were 5 less penalty yards. But aside from that, they had 1 punt blocked. They gave up a huge kickoff return, as well as consistently giving up solid returns the entire game, and having Brett Kern put on a field position clinic, pinning them at the 9-yard line twice, then at the 2-yard line, which luckily the game was saved once again by the fact that the Chargers' offense and defense absolutely clutched up, putting up 90 more yards on offense to offset this 137 yards of special teams disaster, which is how the Titans were able to even be within a single score at the end of the game. Which lets us move on to the unmitigated disastrous games. Week 1 against the Chiefs, the Chargers were going to put up almost 200 more yards on offense than the Chiefs, but in a punt-heavy game. The Chiefs take it back in blood through punt returns. The Chiefs returners, 2 of them, put up a total of 160 yards and 1 touchdown on 5 returns. And on the 3 punts that weren't returned, they lost 20 yards per punt thanks to touchbacks, meaning that the average net punt for the Chargers was just 20.25 yards per punt, which alone cost them 114 hidden yards. Throw in the Chiefs' average starting field position being at the 37 27-yard line compared to the Chargers' 25. And over the course of a game, the Chiefs stole 256 yards on special teams to balance out the 389 Charger offensive yards and 197 Chiefs offensive yards, which is how they pulled off a 21-14 win over the division rivals. Now, Isaac, can it get worse? I know we've heard about this legendary Lions-Titans game, but can we even ever get close to that again? I think we absolutely can. In their earlier game this season against the Raiders, it was diabolical. The Chargers put up 506 yards of offense, the Raiders 279 yards, but their first 2 punts of the game ended up getting blocked, donating 9 points to the Raiders, as one was for a safety and the other was for a touchdown. Before, on their 3rd punt of the game, it got returned for 46 yards on only a 42-yard boot, and do you know what that means? On 3 punt attempts, they, not a single time, gave the Raiders a worse field position than where they punted it from, which is nuts, especially when you tie in the fact that on the flip side of the ball, Shane Leckler netted 47.75 yards per punt on the day, meaning the punt discrepancy by itself was 187 yards, tied in with the field position change as the Raiders were getting solid kickoff returns all day, meaning they stole 338 yards of field position right from under the noses of the Chargers to pretty much all but ensure they had no chance of winning that game. But what if I told you that wasn't the worst one? For the piece de resistance, let me take you to week 3, Seahawks. Now, up to this point, they had a week 1 unmitigated disaster of 256 yards lost. Then that was followed up by a manageable 113-yard nightmare where they were just so much better than their opposition it didn't end up mattering. But this game would be horrendous, despite it not starting off too bad. But near the end of the half, things would quickly collapse. A short punt return on top of a holding call set the Seahawks up on the positive side of the 50, which is easy scoring range. Then the ensuing kickoff was fumbled, and that should have led to another score, although the defense stuffed them at the goal line. But once again, they open up the second half with a kickoff return touchdown. The Seahawks find another great return out to the 45, and then in the 4th, give up their second kickoff return touchdown of the day. With all of this averaging the Seahawks out to starting, yes, their average starting field position being at midfield, and the ridiculous kickoff return yards totaling to 388 yards in their favor, which is how they lost by 7 points when outgaining Seattle 426 yards to Seattle's 203. But my favorite stat in all of this is that in the games where the Chargers held up opposing teams to less than 150-yard buffer in hidden yards and didn't turn the ball over 4 more times, they were 9-3, only losing to the Bengals, who randomly played a great game, the Rams, where they missed the game-tying field goal, and the Raiders, who just had their number this year. But the total number that this monstrosity of a season brings us to is that the Chargers lost in total 1,521 yards in a 16-game season, which, if you want something to compare it to, I was dunking on the Titans earlier this season for having 2 games below 150 yards, and while one of those games, yes, was maybe the worst special team performance of all time, the Chargers were losing 95 yards per game, which is something we may just never see again.